In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. When you hear that thunder rolling, fare thee well, fare thee well. When you see that lightning crashing, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. There's a better day a-coming, fare thee well, fare thee well. There's a world of peace and justice, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, getting up morning, that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, getting up morning, that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great get up, get up, get up, 'cause it's a morning, that great get up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great get up, get up, 'cause it's a morning, that great get up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great get up morning, fare thee well, get up, 'cause it's a morning, that great get up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great get up morning, fare thee well, get up, 'cause it's a morning, that great get up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great get up morning, stay morning, fare thee well. In that great get up morning, stay morning, fare thee well. In that great get up morning, fare thee well. In that great get up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great get up morning, fare thee well. Fare thee well, fare thee well.
On behalf of the United Church of Christ, we welcome you to Juneteenth 2020, and still we rise. We welcome you, along with all of the participants today who will be speaking. We welcome you into a moment where we can reflect on what it means to be a person of African descent. Juneteenth commemorates Freedom Day. It's also a look back for those of our ancestors who were enslaved, still held in bondage in Texas. It was June 19th, 1865, when Union Army General Gordon Granger led thousands of federal troops into Galveston to announce that the Civil War had ended. With the end of the Civil War, the enslaved were set free from being held in bondage and unpaid labor for over 250 years. Our ancestors were free. Freedom Day came 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln encountered objections in the North and in the South to sign into law the Emancipation Proclamation, a law which guaranteed all enslaved persons would be set free across the nation. On December 31st, 1862, our ancestors watched and waited for the stroke of midnight to enact their right to freedom. And on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Our ancestors were free. However, political goodwill, signatures on paper, and laws do not guarantee that people of African descent will receive protection under the law, and the evidence is before us in 2020. We are witnesses to the ongoing assaults and insults and violent acts against Black bodies. Medgar, Malcolm, Martin, Tamir, Trayvon, Rekia, Michael, Sandra, Brianna, Ahmaud, Tony, and George Floyd. And still we rise. We honor our ancestors. Because of them and their DNA, we survived the Middle Passage. We rise to highlight and celebrate our genius and intellect, creativity, and diversity of expressions. We rise to protect our children. We rise to protest, rebel, and resist white supremacy and nationalism threats against our existence as free people. We rise unapologetically as Christians. We rise as followers of Jesus Christ, the sun-kissed, brown-skinned, Northeast African Palestinian Jew who lived among diverse people, died at the behest of state-sanctioned violence, and rose again to underscore and reiterate liberation and justice for all. In the spirit of Juneteenth, and in this moment, we rise.
I offer a question and not a statement. When is someday? I had my sermon prepared for this Sunday. I was ready to share with you the 3rd chapter of Exodus. When Moses encountered God for the first time, he stood upon holy ground and had to take his shoes off. He looked into the bush that was burning, but was not consumed. He heard God's voice say, "I am that I am, and I've heard the misery of my people." It was my expectation to share this word in this new rhythm of this pandemic as we record the sermon early prior to Sunday. But the press of current events moved into the homiletical space as tragedy hung in the air. My spirit is vexed, I must be honest. And my heart is broken, and my rage is only tempered by the holy lament anchoring me in this moment. The death of Ahmaud Arbery was heartbreaking. The death of Breonna Taylor was soul-wrenching. and witnessing the death of George Floyd has drained my soul. When is someday? Now I know the song, "We Shall Overcome." It rests in my memory as the song speaks about we shall overcome someday. But I have a question of when is that someday? Is someday when there are no more bones to break, throats to choke, hearts to stop, and sleeping women to shoot? When is someday? Now, I must admit that deep in my heart, I do believe people of grace and moral courage will one day render a new painting on the canvas of this broken democracy. But when is someday? Is someday nothing but a distant dream dangling before us as a demonic taunt? I don't know. But I do want to know, when is someday? How many bodies must be broken, lives lost, mothers wailing in anguish, and then you say, some of you, I need to wait until all the facts come out. What else do you need to speak with some degree of authority when you see a human being die before your eyes? A man dead in the street, killed by a man kneeling upon his neck as he gasped for his last breath. I guess it is easy to dismiss death with the people dying before you when they're only considered 3/5 of a human being. When is someday? Is it the moment caskets filled with black bodies block the view of Central Park from Trump Tower? Is it when our throats are so weary from shouting in anguish that speech can no longer be formed upon our lips? When is someday? When is someday? When is someday? When will that day come? When is someday? As a person charged with the prophetic care of this congregation, known as Trinity United Church of Christ, I must address the collective pain that is felt not only in this village, but across this nation, especially to those who desire to no longer live under the viral agent known as racism. We as a people are called to do more than pray, shed tears, or stand in protest for one day. Now, all of these acts are necessary and needed as an outgrowth of our trauma and spiritual therapy. I say this to every person who is under the sound of my voice. This nation has a fundamental flaw in its soul. This nation has a spiritual defect that only a revolution and revival can heal. A moral revival, a spiritual revolution, where lives matter, repentance takes place, and systems are destroyed by light that banishes the darkness. I must share this with you. I love this tradition, the tradition we call the Black Church. I love this tradition of hope that is unafraid to face horror, this tradition of possibility that is afraid to stare down pain. I'm a follower of Christ. I am a believer in the God of Harriet, the God of Frederick, the God of Fanny, the God of Richard, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We must face these moments with a spiritual power not drawn from the well of the one who oppresses, but from the power that has the power to transform us, that has been passed down, which is much stronger than any other power that we will encounter. And I say to you this day, do not ask the question, where is God? I challenge you to hear the question that God is asking of us today, where are you? It is not where is God, but where are you? Each of our ancestors took hold of this question and they answered the call to open doors for generations not yet born. Harriet did not ask, where is God? She heard the question, God saying to her, where are you? Sojourner did not ask, where is God? She heard the question, God saying to her, where are you? Frederick Douglass heard the question and said, I answer. Ida answered, Du Bois answered, Garvey answered, Mays answered, Thurman answered, Fanny answered, Ella answered. Are you going to answer? Or will you just curl up in a corner and say, where is God? Instead of hearing the question that God is saying to us, where are you?
When is someday? I'd like to make space in this moment for us to take a look back. Because if we don't take a look back at the sacred memory and the sacred moments of our Black lives, we miss who we are as a people of African descent, created in God's image, first peoples, and the cradle of civilization. Archaeological records and substantiated research document our earliest beginnings. The research and documents state, when humans first ventured out of Africa some 60,000 years ago, they left genetic footprints still visible today. By mapping the appearance and frequency of genetic markers in modern peoples, a picture is created when and where ancient humans moved around the world. These great migrations eventually led the descendants of a small group of Africans to occupy even the farthest reaches of the earth. Our species is an African one. Africa is where we first evolved and where we have spent the majority of our time on earth. Africans are the architects of the world's first civilizations. Africans and their descendants held wealth and positions of power as kings and queens. The continent is home to over 3,000 different ethnic groups speaking more than 1,200 different languages. However, our history was interrupted by the invasion and opportunistic enterprise for wealth and land by Europeans from Spain, England, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Yes, we have lost our people between 1615 and 1900, 479,900 from Senegambia, 1,035,600 from the Gold Coast, 2,016,000 from the Bight of Benin, 4,179,000 from West Central Africa. It is estimated that between 10,240,000 and 200 million Africans were transported across the transatlantic Middle Passage. But not without revolts, rebellions, and uprisings before our ancestors left on ships from the West African coast to the arrival on the North American coast. It was the White Lion, a 160-ton Dutch privateer ship flying a British flag, landed at Comfort Point in Virginia. We are people of resistance. Resistance resides in our DNA. The radical contract enacted to terrorize, traumatize, and derail our existence. Today, it is declared null and void. Null and void. The contract does no longer exist. We rise. We rise. we rise in the spirit of resistance.
As Maya Angelou would say, you may write us down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread us in the very dirt, but still, like dust, we rise. People of African descent have been rising and will continue to rise. The inventors of African descent featured today made monumental contributions to the world. Who can imagine living in today's society without dry cleaning? Can you imagine living without a security system in your homes or apartments, a mechanism where you could see who was approaching your property? Imagine what life would be like without satellite technology. So much for Zoom and cell phone service and the ability to record police brutality and post it instantly on social media. African-American inventors Thomas Jennings, Marie von Britten Brown, and Valerie Thomas are trailblazing pioneers of all of these technological innovations. Their Black lives mattered. It is only because of them that we are able to enjoy some of the creature comforts, now really human necessities, such as clean clothes, home security, and internet technology. Their inventions give testimony to the creative and intellectual genius of the African mind. And I trust that they are now standing on tiptoe on the balconies of heaven to see how we will match and even surpass them in innovation, brilliance, beauty, and activism. So get busy, beloved. The creation waits with eager longing for the further revealing of the sun-kissed children of God.
Resistance is in our DNA. It is God whom you see when you see our Black bodies. It is God who kissed us with melanin aesthetic glory and breathed life into us. It is God who then declared us human, worthy, and good. So of course, resistance is in our DNA. That which is good resists evil. A community of free-born humans enslaved by the evilness of an oppressor clung to its cultural identity, its faith, its God, and resisted a co-opted and perverted message disguised as the Christian gospel. A perverted message that unsuccessfully sought to strip enslaved Africans of their human dignity and deny their humanity was resisted. Out of resistance, white slave Christianity was rejected, and the true gospel, a liberative gospel, was embraced. Resistance is in our DNA. From the resistance emerged prophetic voices, and their Black lives mattered. One prophet, Jarena Lee, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, resisted the sexist and racist claim that God would not entrust the proclamation of the gospel to her Black female body. Lee exclaimed, God made manifest God's power in a manner sufficient to show the world that she was called to labor according to her ability and the grace given to her. Lee is credited as being the first African-American woman to preach the gospel publicly, and she did that at a time when slavery was still legal and women could not own property or vote. Resistance is in our DNA. Dr. James Hal Cone, another prophet, in response to the atrocities of the Jim Crow era, denial of civil rights for persons of color, and the public lynchings of precious Black bodies, birthed liberation theology. Cone believed Christian theology is about God's liberating activity in the world and God's activity on behalf of the oppressed, thereby fortifying those of African descent with the necessary power to break the chains of oppression over body, mind, and spirit. Black liberation theology affirmed the human dignity of Black lives and gave theological language for why Black lives matter. Resistance is in our DNA. Beloved Jarena Lee and James Cone resisted a false and oppressive gospel, spoke truth to power, claimed God of the oppressed, and proclaimed unashamedly the true gospel in which Black folks embody God and therefore matter. What would they say to us today? Resist. In the spirit of our ancestors, we remain without sanctuary.
40 men rode into Oakmont night and entered the mother and son were hauled by wagon 6 miles west of town and were swung from
the New York Times reported that the victims were tortured with knives before being
His
hanged.
charred corpse was hung for public display in front of a blacksmith.
Dead nigger, then riddled with bullets.
You did the work of men today, and your deeds will resound in every state, village, and hamlet.
I am a picker. It is my living and my avocation. I search out items that some people don't want or need, and then sell them to others who do. In America, everything is for sale, even a national shame. Until I came upon a postcard of a lynching, postcards seemed trivial to me, the way second-hand, misshapen Rubbermaid products might seem now. Ironically, the pursuit of these images has brought to me a great sense of purpose and personal satisfaction. Studying these photographs has engendered in me a caution of whites, of the majority, of the young, of religion, of the accepted. Perhaps a certain circumspection concerning these things was already in me, but surely not as actively as after the first sight of a brittle postcard of Leo Frank dead in an oak tree. It wasn't the corpse that bewildered me as much as the canine thin faces of the pack, lingering in the woods, circling after the kill. Hundreds of flea markets later, a trader pulled me aside and in conspiratorial tones offered to sell me a real photo postcard. It was Laura Nelson, hanging from a bridge, caught so pitiful and tattered and beyond retrieving, like a paper kite snagged on a utility wire. That image of Laura layered a pall of grief over all my fears. I believe the photographer was more than a perceptive spectator at lynchings. Too often they compulsively composed silvery tableaux, nature morte, positioning and lighting corpses as if they were game birds shot on the wing. Indeed, the photographic art played as significant a role in the ritual as torture or souvenir grabbing, creating a sort of two-dimensional biblical swine, a receptacle for a collective sinful self. Lust propelled the commercial reproduction and distribution of the images, facilitating the endless replay of anguish. Even dead, the victims were without sanctuary. These photographs provoke a strong sense of denial in me and a desire to freeze my emotions. In time, I realize that my fear of the other is fear of myself. Then these portraits, torn from other family albums, become the portraits of my own family and of myself. And the faces of the living and the faces of the dead recur in me and in my daily life. I've seen John Richards alone on a remote county road, rocking along in hobby horse strides, head low, eyes to the ground, spotting coins or rocks or roots. And I've encountered Laura Nelson in a small, sturdy woman who answered my knock on a back porch door. In her deep-set eyes, I watched a silent crowd parade across a shiny steel bridge, looking down. And on Christmas Lane, just blocks from our home, I've observed another Leo, a small-framed boy with his shirt tail out and skull cap off-center, as he made his way to Sabbath prayers. With each encounter, I can't help thinking of these photos, and the march of time, and of the cold steel trigger in the human heart.
We have chosen to again rise up, humbly standing upon the shoulders of our ancestors, who were queens, kings, inventors, doctors, priestesses, and not the savages you have labeled them. We demand justice and equal protection, a right given to all citizens by the U.S. Constitution.
After viewing this historical montage of the strange fruit of lynched Black bodies, we pause for a few moments to name the need for Black folk to engage again our sacred memory, specifically through the practices of re-memorying and lament. The generations who witnessed the terror of the evil, anti-Black, white supremacist the public spectacle of the lynching of Black bodies of women and men in the United States prayed that the next generation would never have to experience such an unimaginable terror. And yet, here we are again, living through the literal and figurative lynching of Black bodies, Black humanity, the Black right to exist, to be. It is overwhelming, and it is overwhelming many of our spirits. Yet, like so many of our ancestors, we resist, because we do not have the option of giving up, turning back, and or checking out of this fight for our lives. If we listen closely, we will hear our ancestors not only calling us to resist, we will hear them summoning us to return to the hush hours, to the clearing spaces, to the communal songs and storytelling, to the congregational gatherings, whether virtual or physical, and to the still moments where we can connect to the divine source by taking seriously the healing and restorative properties of communal remembering and lament. In 1995, the a cappella group of Black women called Sweet Honey in the Rock released the song I Remember, I Believe. The first verse of the song reads, I don't know how my mother walked her trouble down. I don't know how my father stood his ground. I don't know how my people survived slavery. I do remember, that's why I believe. From the title and throughout the lyrics of this song, the writer Bernice Johnson Reagan connects sacred memory, remembering and re-memorying to the divine, to lament and mystery, and to claiming our Blackness as gift and naming our pain as a path forward, a path through, all of which are necessary for the long-term marathon work of being Black in an anti-Black world and doing the justice work we must do. Thus, on the front end of this Juneteenth observance, this movement, we create this space to call upon our ancestors as we remember and we gather our history that includes both inhumane suffering and episodes of human freedom. Just as in the Black Christian religious tradition, we do not rush past Good Friday to rest in the victory of Easter's resurrection. We too linger with lament. with our gaze and resolve fixed on liberation. So, beloved, today we remember that one form of slavery has ended, and we lament that the enslavement of Black humanity continues to resurface through the actions of the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, the great-great-grandchildren of white supremacy. We remember that emancipation came to our ancestors, and we lament that news of it came 2.5 years after its legislative declaration. And we remember the ingenuity, resiliency, and vision of our ancestors in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we lament that over 300 women, children, and men were mercilessly massacred there without anyone ever being held accountable for their deaths, a pattern that is being repeated in our lives today. Beloved, remember where we have collectively traveled. Lament that our journey has included and still includes treading our path through the blood of the slaughter. Take from this place, this space, this virtual space, what we need for our journey forward. Make room to re-member and to linger with our communal lament, for we need these practices so we can continue to fight and to hope. Amen and Ashe. In the spirit of our traditions.
The bones remember freedom. The bones remember freedom. The bones remember freedom. That's what the ancestors say. The bones remember freedom. The bones remember freedom. The bones remember freedom. That's what the ancestors say. And we've got the power to rise up. We've got the power to rise up. We've got the power to rise up. That's what the ancestors say. Melizzi was barely 8 years old when she had seen the horrors of enslavement with her own eyes, just like those images you had seen, and they shook her to the core. When she gathered with her mama and her grandma and her aunties and her uncles in the cabin that night, she was distraught. And so they did the only thing they knew to do. They covered her with song and they covered her with stories. Her mama said, "You must know that the bones remember freedom." My mama told me that. Your grandma, who was free when she was your age on the other side of the water, she did not live in slavery. Oh, she ran free. She went to the water. She worked in the garden with all of the children and all of the elders, and life was beautiful, and her bones remembered that. Even when she was taken from home and brought to this side of the world, Melizzi could see her grandmother smiling in the corner, and she could see her mama and everybody else leaning in, and then she heard the old story. They say that those bones give us the power to fly. And we've had it ever since we arrived. Melizzi said, "What do you mean, the power to fly? How is that possible?" Oh, my child, if you know, then you know when the times are unbearable, you can climb up on the air as if you were walking onto a stair. And they told stories of how they had seen people beaten down in the fields and how the ones whose bones were strong with the memory came and sang for them. And they lifted themselves up, they rose up, and some flew away.
Now, Melizzi had never seen anybody fly away. She had seen people disappear, and she heard that they had made their way to freedom. And so when that Sunday, June 18, 1865 rolled around and Melizzi woke to the sounds of a fife and drum and the sounds of 2,000 soldiers coming into Galveston, she wondered what in the world was happening. And early that next day, that Monday morning, Juneteenth, June 19, 1865, Melizzi and her whole family got up early. And they went to join with the crowd that was standing outside the Ashton Villa right there in Galveston, Texas. The only one made of brick, the only home 3 stories high. And she was in that crowd when the gates opened up on that balcony, and she heard General Granger read those words. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. And she heard first a stillness come over the crowd as the rest of the words were read, and then she heard the eruption of the song and the dance and the celebration and the jubilation. We're free, we're free, we're free. And as she moved her body, she said, my bones remember freedom. It was a jubilant day, that first June 19th, 1865. And I wish I could tell you that every Juneteenth after that was as joyous for Melizzi and her family and all those who had been finally released from the enslavement. But in that next year, the laws had made it so that Black people could be snatched up off the road, and they were frightened in order to stay away from the prisons, and she saw more terror. And when that first anniversary rolled around, they gathered together and they gave a silent recognition, a silent day of gratitude for their freedom. Melizzi's family, like so many others, eventually left Galveston and made it north towards Houston to Freedman's Town. And they found themselves in a church with the Reverend Jack Yates, who said, we are going to work with our freedom. We are going to learn what we need to learn. We are going to buy property. We're going to save our money. And we are going to buy ourselves a park so no one can come on our land and destroy us. Nobody will be able to keep us from celebrating. It took a long time for that community to save $1,000. But in 1872, the folks there in Freedman's Town with the Reverend Jack Yates purchased 10 acres of land near Houston, Texas. And they gathered themselves together on June 19th, 1872. They dressed themselves up, and they brought their finest foods, and they brought their bones and their memories from before the time they were enslaved, from the time they were enslaved, and from this time they were free again. They knew in the telling of their stories that as long as their bones remembered that they were free, whenever troubles came around, they would be able to gather themselves again and rise up. And that, my friends, is a story for today. We have the power to rise up. We have the power to rise up. We have the power to rise up. That's what the old folks say. And now, in the spirit of our rituals,
listen to these words from a poem called Whispers in the Sugarcane Fields. And it's from a book of poetry that I wrote called Drums in Our Veins. the smell of rain in the air, the clean, crisp earth stained with blood, bodies in chains, the smell rising across the soil assaults the senses, unmasking the sharp edges of the leaves, moving gently, whispering softly in the sugarcane fields. Blue sunshine-filled skies are a promise of the future distant. Instead, in the hush of the morning, clouds roll across the skies, rain lightly falling, no sound. The silence of death in the sugarcane fields. Where did time go? Not the night or the morning, years flying swiftly on vast wings while I was sleeping, growing sunspots and wrinkles, generations dead, worked like machines, treated like animals in the sugarcane fields. This sky, this rain, prophesy of the storm to come, waters to cleanse, to sweep away the injustice and the unjust, thunder to bellow the rage and the fear of exploited labor named slaves in the sugarcane fields. This storm, not first or last, change is inevitable. Like the growth of the stalk planted with hatred, watered with pain, consuming lives, the muck of the soil, corruption and greed, rebellion rises, fueled by need, another generation beaten in the sugarcane fields. The stalks whisper, telling tales of yesterday and tomorrow, telling of sorrow, recalling horrors of sweet powder extracted, while robbing the sweetness of dignity and freedom, leaving behind broken bodies with the bitterness of molasses. Yesterday is today in the sugarcane fields. The skies open up, refusing to hold on to secrets of generations in the sun, bruised and beaten, letting go of all these skies have seen. The screams gone unheard, no longer silent, the lightning flashes, the thunder roars, rejecting silence, weeping loudly, mourning the losses in the sugarcane fields. This morning, we come and we remember. We bring light. The candle has been lit in memory of those who have gone before. This moment is sacred. Listen to these words from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith, our ancestors received approval. By faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. And so in this morning moment today, we honor that which is visible and invisible among us. In that I include the Creator, ever present, and the host of witnesses that are the ancestors, the elements and all of nature, and all of you. As we gather today, we are cognizant of the presence and blessings of the ancestor, of the creator of Wakantanka, called by many names. The creator and giver of life connects all that exists, deeming sacred the energy that connects us. We acknowledge the first peoples of this land, wherever we stand today. And so I recognize the land on which we stand today as the traditional home of the Iroquois speakers, the Wyandot and the Mingo. I acknowledge them as the past, the present, and the future caretakers of this land. And so we name this place as sacred, not because we believe it to be so, but because it is so. We are sacred. This place is sacred. And this moment is sacred. We are present with the elements surrounding us. The earth, the air, the water, and fire are present. A reminder that God is present in all things and has formed and made all things well. Our senses are fully engaged as we see, hear, smell, touch, and taste of the beauty of life. We stand on Mother Earth under the canopy and care of Father Sky, who remind us that all of this earth and all of this life, including Black life, is sacred. And so we name this place as sacred, not because we believe it to be so, but because it is so. We are sacred. This place is sacred. This moment is sacred. And so we gather the energy of the moon. We are in a new moon cycle. The new moon invites us to new beginnings, an opportunity to achieve a new start, to embark on new goals and on a new journey. And so this morning, wherever you are, we name this place as sacred, not because we must, not because we believe it to be so, but because it is so. We are sacred. This place is sacred, and this moment is sacred. The light journeys with us in this moment. And so we call in this moment on the names of the ancestors, those who have gone before, ancestors who gave us life and are witnesses to this moment. And I invite you wherever you are to call those names as I go through this moment. And we're gonna pour libation because it is so, and we will bless this moment. We call the names of the ancestors, those who have gone before, ancestors who gave us life and are witnesses to this moment. We give thanks for those who have gone before, for the kings and queens of Africa renamed as chattel and enslaved. We give thanks for the gifts that they have given to us. And so we say Ashe. They have given their love, their resilience, and their wit, their wisdom, their strength, and their entrepreneurial undertakings, their gifts of healing, intuition, and caring. We see these gifts manifested in each of us today. And so we say Ashe. We call on the ancestors. All the way back to Creator and Light. We acknowledge the millions who have made us who we are. There are many whose names we do not know. For them we say Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. We call on these ancestors. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo. In the spirit of sacred land.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for the United Church of Christ Juneteenth celebration by recording this video. We have with us today Marco Cable, the Area Executive for Global Ministries Africa Office. And of course, Global Ministries is the United Church of Christ and the Christian Church of Christ working together in mission. We have with us Phyllis Bird, a Global Ministries mission co-worker who has spent the last 30 years working in Kenya, serving in Kenya. She is with the Organization of African Instituted Churches. And we also have with us Mr. Miles Owusu, a co-founder of Atrium, a company located in Ghana that specializes in IT serving across West Africa. Thank you all for joining us. My part in planning this day was to make a connection with the continent of Africa. So thank you for joining us, and we start with Marco.
No, thank you very much, Phyllis. Brothers and sisters, happy Juneteenth Day. It is such a blessing for us to pause and to remember this significant event in our lives as a people of African descent here in these United States of America. Oftentimes when we talk about our journey in this country, it begins at 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the United States. But yet to know who we are, we have to journey beyond 1619, and we have to recognize and acknowledge that the first enslaved Africans had an identity. They had a cultural identity. They had a religious identity. They were Africans. And oftentimes we ignore that important part of who they were because we emphasize the enslavement. Often we do not hear about the great ancient societies of our ancestors, the great schools we were able to build, our oneness with creation, that we were able to use things in nature to cure our ailments, nor is there much conversation about the royal families across the continent, or the clearly defined roles in family and society, or the religious pluralism. Oftentimes I hear people talk about that they are African, and that says a lot, but at the same time, it's not very descriptive of who we are, but given the vastness of the continent. In fact, Africa is made up of 54 countries, 3,000 distinct ethnic groups, over 2,000 languages are spoken. Often I tell people that when you want to engage Africa, you have to make a lifelong commitment because of the great diversity on the continent. That the way that one ethnic group has organized its life together is vastly different than another ethnic group. And it also is a reminder that Africa is dynamic. It's not static. It's constantly growing. It's constantly changing. And also the influence from the West and other outside entities, thanks to technology, also influences modern African societies. Although I speak of the diversity of Africa, I will say that there are some common themes that I have observed in engaging communities across the continent. One is the resourcefulness of Africans, their ongoing contribution to all academic disciplines, the recognition that the we is greater than the I, the deep religious nature of the continent. Africans are very religious, although there's multiple religious identities. Christianity and Islam are the largest religious identities, but yet there are some other native or traditional religious practices that happens all over the continent. And the thing that has impressed me the most, and I think that's very instructive to us as a people here in the United States, is that the Africans have preserved their cultural identity. When it was a real effort to crowd out who they were by the colonial rule, that they held on to the greatness of who they were and have passed it on from generations and generations. We also are reminded that as we were loosening, as we were shaking off our shackles of enslavement, the rise of colonialism was probably at its height in the 1870s and for decades moving forward. And so again, I say happy Juneteenth, and I invite you to continue the journey of learning more about our sisters and brothers on the continent of Africa.
Thank you very much. And further to Marco's wonderful statement, I also want to say happy Juneteenth to my brothers and sisters. And I want to touch on the subject from the other side of the continent, being a Ghanaian. I want to tell you a little bit about what is being done by Africans on the continent currently to help bridge that link that was broken many years ago as a result of the separation. Currently, the government of Ghana is working on a policy that will allow our brothers and sisters across the globe to be able to relocate to Ghana and, you know, connect with the rest of the Black community. One thing that I just feel like I need to tell you about is a statement from the president of Ghana. And what he said was that the destiny of Black people in the world, wherever they are bound up with Africa performing and elevates the status of all Black people around the world. And on performing Africa continues a situation where Blacks around the world are looked at. So it is very critical that we break that link between our brothers on the other side of the ocean and the continent. But a lot of work also depends on us to make it easy for them to return to the continent. Now, as you know, Africa has a lot of countries, 54 countries or so. And the thing is, not every country is up to speed with this program. So you may have to try to understand which part or which countries are doing these programs. I know the others will catch up eventually. So that at least in your process of visiting or planning to visit Africa, you have this at the back of your mind. Currently, as we speak, the Ghana government has presented a bill in the parliament, what we call the Homeland Return Bill, which will give a clear path for our brothers and sisters of African ancestry to be able to come and go as they wish. Those who would like to have a dual citizenship will have that opportunity, and those who just want extended stay can come and go. It's been a long time coming. Previously, it's been difficult because we have changes in government, and every government comes and they have their own priorities, and things get pushed back a little bit. But this current government is really doing its best to bridge that bond. So I will encourage our brothers and sisters to, as much as possible, try to visit the continent, as much as possible over a period of time to acclimatize and to get the system ready to go. So on the other side, our brothers also will have to make an effort to make it easy for you to settle in. So in conclusion, let's encourage each other. Let's work very hard to make this a reality. Thank you.
I want to pick up where Miles have just left off when he talked about Africa performing. And I think that in order for Africa to perform, the Africans in the diaspora also have to perform. So in one sense, we're intricately related to each other in that how do we perform? And one of the areas that I want to lift up is that while we are looking at issues that we are facing in the United States, whether it be the poor quality of water, whether it be poverty issues, hunger issues, poor health, the state of the Americas, or people all over the African diaspora, I would hope that we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which was set out by the United Nations. And by 2030, they want these issues, 17 goals, to be completed. But these goals are some of the issues that we're struggling with in Africa. So as we lobby, as we talk about issues of poverty, as we talk about issues of poor water quality or other issues of gender equality, I pray that we feel the connection of not just talking about our issues that we are struggling with in America, in the Caribbean, in Canada, but yet issues that wherever we find people of color, we are most affected by these issues. Being in Africa for 30 years has been a wonderful journey. And I say welcome, and welcome the connections, and welcome us saying, how do we figure this all out together and work together? Thank you.
Sure. And I want to remind us as members of the United Church of Christ that through Global Ministries, we nurture approximately 50 relationships across the continent in 16 countries. Also, I think it's important on this day that we recognize that we are in the middle of the United Nations International Decade of African Descendants that started in 2015. Come join the movement with us. Come visit the continent. Start the journey of learning about our people and sharing about who we are.
Phyllis, in closing, would you share with us the story that you just shared about your husband and your name and that piece there?
My husband's Luo, one of the ethnic groups in Kenya. And the way one says thank you is Ero Kamano. Ero Kamano, loosely translated, means thank you. But in actuality, it says, you have done what you're supposed to have done. And I think that reminds me of our theology of what it means. It's the body and the blood, the Holy Communion. We're part of each other. And when we take that body and we take that blood, we're one, we're connected. So when we advocate or when we work together, we have done what we're supposed to have done. So I say to each and every one of us, allow Ero Kamano, that thank you, or doing what we're supposed to have done, live out in our everyday life.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you all for being with us for Juneteenth.
The International Decade for People of African Descent, which began in 2015 and lasts until 2024, is intended by the United Nations to bring awareness to the circumstances of the more than 200 million people who identify as people of African descent living in the Americas, and whose identity is distinctive. The International Decade for People of African Descent is an affirmation that Black lives matter. The United Nations has affirmed that the human rights of people of African descent needed to be promoted and protected. The decade has 4 distinct focuses. One is on recognition. The decade is intended to celebrate the contribution of people of African descent worldwide. The decade has a second focus on justice, which seeks to advance policies of inclusion and the eradication of racism, and in particular, anti-Black racism. The decade has a focus on development, the need to promote human rights and insist on creating more better and prosperous communities for people of African descent. And the fourth focus of the decade is to end all forms of discrimination against people of African descent, including issues related to gender, sexuality, women, and girls. The International Decade provides an opportunity for a global conversation around the issues related to people of African descent. And in particularly, it provides an invitation for people of faith to have a conversation about the reality of the lives of people of African descent in our midst. For the United Church of Canada and the United Church of Christ, this has become a critical piece of work that we are committed to doing together, to seek to eliminate discrimination, to seek to create safe and safer spaces for people of African descent, and ultimately to seek an apology from the churches who benefited from the enslavement of people. Together, Karen Georgia Thompson and those of us in the United Church have been working to create other spaces for conversation. Karen Georgia.
Our work together has been very focused over the last few years on finding ways that we together as church can be a part of civil society in addressing racism both locally and globally. The decade has offered us a framework for doing the binational work that is ahead of us, but it also has invited us into conversations with global communities around the plight and the ongoing challenges, as you've heard so far, that are facing African descendant people. The invitation of the decade brings us into this moment to say, what can we do? What are we being invited to do as communities, not just communities of color, not just civil society, but as church people, as folks who understand the gospel and the gift of Jesus Christ, what do we do in this moment around racism and injustices globally? The focus on the decade has brought us into conversations around the United Nations and what can we do with the instrumentalities that are present. I want to focus and shift some of my remarks for this morning to talk about what has been going on globally this week. So in our world this week, brought to the United Nations Human Rights Council was a resolution calling for a commission of inquiry into the death of George Floyd. So far, we have been able to see sign off from the U.S. Human Rights Network, the American Civil Liberties Union. There is a petition that's been going around that was signed and authored by U.S. Human Rights Network, that was signed off by over 600 NGOs globally and over 60 countries. That's what it means to do this work. It means that we can't do it alone. It means that we need to press into what it means to do coalitions and to be in collaborative work together. That resolution is still being put forward. There have been some changes as of this morning, but I also want to say that there was a statement that was also signed off by our churches, some of our churches, co-authored by the United Church of Christ and the United Church of Canada. It was endorsed by the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, Kairos Canada. It was also signed off by the Anglican Church in Canada, the World Council of Churches, and the World Communion of Reformed Churches. And I hope I did not leave anyone out of my list. If so, I apologize. We're grateful for this work, and we will continue to do this kind of work to address the systemic causes of racism. Racism, as we see it and understand it, is rooted someplace. It is rooted in a history that you've seen. It's a history that is about the commodification of Black lives. It is a history about both the transatlantic and the East African slave trades. It is a history that is rooted in underdevelopment and lack of development, both in African countries and in countries that are occupied by African descendant people. And so the work that we do, this collaborative effort, is about our global commitment, because we believe that the global commitment that we have made to address these issues will impact here, it will impact across the Caribbean, and it will impact across the lives of the 200 million descendants of enslaved people who were brought into the Americas. So in the United Nations, we have been through the World Council of Churches in communication with special rapporteurs. We have embraced the work of the Human Rights Council and the work of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. We have moved into not only looking at how do we do Black History Month, but saying that every month is about Black history. We are lifting up the international spaces that afford for opportunities to preach and to teach about the history of a people. We are looking at the ways in which we are all interconnected, and we're asking the question, how do we come to a comprehensive narrative about the history of African peoples brought into the Americas? How do we tell that story that is about African Americans here in the United States, that is also about a diaspora that runs from Nova Scotia all the way back down into South America and across the Caribbean, places where our lives have been interrupted, places where we're still struggling to have freedom. This is the work that is ahead of us. And so in our commitment, we continue on this journey. We have questions that need to be answered. How do we get to questions about development? One of the pieces that you saw in the video was about the Sustainable Development Goals. We are very unfamiliar, some of us, with the SDGs. Learn them, and know the ways in which they can impact our communities. Know them and learn the ways in which we can use them to make sure that our communities are receiving what they need. I want to talk a little bit about reparations. Reparations is one of those words, when we talk about reparations, folks flinch because all people hear is money. Folks want to know, how much am I going to get paid? And folks want to know, how much are you going to ask me for? That is not the scope of a reparations project. A reparations project is about the totality of justice. It's about saying, how do we level the playing field? How do we afford lifting people for whom societies have rendered, well, a little bit lower status, not because we identify ourselves as such, but because the economic freedoms that we need have not been given. Because the ways in which we have been enculturated into societies have determined that we are worth less than we know ourselves to be. So one of the pieces that I want to draw our attention to is the CARICOM reparations plan. CARICOM, which is a Caribbean community, has a 10-point reparations plan. And I want to use that reparations plan this morning to talk about what it means when we talk about reparations. So the first thing that the plan calls for is a full apology. Yes, that too is a part of repairing the breach, of restoring commitment and community. Repatriation. What does it mean for to have over 10 million people who were stolen from their homes? What does it mean for us to then have a program that will establish channels of international law and diplomacy to resettle those who want to be resettled? The third piece that they talk about in this program is Indigenous Peoples Development Program. That's important. So when we're talking about reparations, we're not just talking about what happens with the descendants of African people. We're also talking about the displacement of individuals in these places in which we live. So what does it mean to have an Indigenous Peoples program? Cultural institutions they're calling for. They're calling for attention to public health issues. So in this moment where we're experiencing COVID, we're seeing that there's a disproportionate number of people of African descent and people of color who are affected by this virus. And it's because of the inherent health disparities that we're already facing. They're also asking for illiteracy eradication. Think about it. And I want to read this part. And this pertains to the Caribbean, and it's also true here. At the end of the European colonial period in most parts of the Caribbean, the British in particular left the Black and Indigenous communities in a general state of illiteracy. Some 70% of Blacks in British colonies were functionally illiterate in the 1960s. We're talking about 50 years ago, 70% of the Black communities in colonized areas were illiterate. And that is why it's so important for us to be focused on education in these moments. The seventh is an African knowledge program. As it was said, we don't know where we come from. We know very little about the continent, 54 countries. Which one do we come from? We don't have a comprehensive history, so we need these kinds of things. psychological rehabilitation. We have suffered trauma, historical trauma that we carry in our DNA, current trauma that comes from seeing over and over and over again the traumatization and the degradation of Black lives. Imagine the psychological care that we need from seeing a white man with his knee on the neck of a Black man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Psychological rehabilitation. Technology transfer and debt cancellation for the many countries in the Caribbean and globally who have channels whose development has been stymied. I put that to you to say we need to be talking constructively about reparations. We need to be talking about the ways in which our institutions that continue to uphold institutional racism, what are they going to do about education? Because our education is also about our freedom. And our churches need to get involved in this moment in ensuring that our commitments to freedom are not just surface, that our commitments to freedom are also in our pockets and in our willingness to let go and relinquish of power so that freedom can indeed be present for all. So I'm going to turn it back to Michael to talk a little bit about the Canadian context.
So as we continue to work at the decade, recognizing that it's not simply a statement of the UN, but it's important for a kind of lived reality in our context. In the Canadian context, the Anglican Church of Canada, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the United Church in Canada have begun a process, made a statement, but have begun a process of working together to engage our churches and our church communities with addressing the issues related to people of African descent within the Canadian context. In many ways, in the Canadian context, we are silent and missing, partly because of the politeness of the way in which racism gets expressed here in Canada. But we know it's important for the transformation of our institutions, but also for the transformation of the lives of people of African descent in this part of the continent, that this work be done.
So we have the Canadian context. We're familiar with what's going on here, and we're so aware that we're joined by others from around the world as well. And so in this moment, I want to issue a call to action, and you'll hear more about that later as well. But I invite you to think about the ways in which you too can become more familiar with the UN International Decade for People of African Descent and their resources on the United Church of Christ webpage. We will make those available. I want to point out to you that you can familiarize yourself with the histories and the contemporary ways in which other peoples are affected, other communities, other Black communities globally are affected by the history that is also impacting here in the United States. And so on this Juneteenth, as the darkness of the new moon is about to overtake us, may we embark on a new journey and set new goals and set new designs to travel together, to journey together, so that this moment will not be in vain, that we will continue to stand on the ancestors who journey with us, who walk with us, who lend us of their wisdom, that we will journey together to ensure that all have freedom with dignity and respect. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
And so in the spirit of the moment, we honor African descendants.
In honoring those whose shoulders we stand upon, we would like to list some of the names of those who have come before us and those who have made an impactful gift upon the world. While no list can be complete, there are many names who may be unfamiliar to many, but whose contributions undergird all who came after them. This is a brief lifting up of women and men who have succeeded against all odds. Some historical influencers: Carter G. Woodson, historian, author, creator of what became Black History Month. Maya Angelou, poet, entertainer, author, activist. Augusta Savage, sculptor and activist. James Baldwin, author, activist. Lorraine Hansberry, playwright, activist. Mae Jemison, astronaut, physician, scientist, author. Daniel Hale Williams, surgeon, advocate for African Americans in medicine. Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels, first Black congressperson in 1870 representing Mississippi. Ida B. Wells, journalist, activist. Katherine Johnson, mathematician and NASA scientist. Ella Baker, activist. Bayard Rustin, activist.
Reverend Ben Chavis, activist. Phyllis Wheatley, first published African American poet. Thurgood Marshall, first African American U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Dred Scott, sued for his and his family's freedom, denial by the U.S. Supreme Court, which led to the Civil War. Sojourner Truth, abolitionist and women's civil rights activist. Frederick Douglass, abolitionist, author, orator. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, social activists and co-founders of the Black Panther Party. Madam C.J. Walker, first African-American woman millionaire. Jeremiah Hamilton, first African-American man millionaire. Jackie Robinson, first African-American in the National Baseball League. Arthur Ashe, activist and first African-American tennis player selected to the U.S. Davis Cup team, only Black man ever to win the singles title at Wimbledon, the U.S. Open, and the Australian Open. Wilma Rudolph, civil rights and women's rights activist on the world record holding Olympian champion and international sports icon in track and field. Jesse Owens, a four-time gold medalist in track and field in 1936 Olympic Games. Carl Stokes, the first African-American mayor of a major city in 1967. And here are a handful of UCC elders upon whom those of us of African descent stand on, whose shoulders upon we stand upon. Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk, first African-American woman ordained in the UCC, leader of the former Office of Church and Society. Reverend Dr. Bernice Powell Jackson, former officer of the church, founding executive minister of Justice and Witness Ministries. Reverend Henrietta Andrews, pastor, mentor, Associate Conference Minister of Michigan, Spiritual Director. Reverend Charles Shelby Rooks, past President of Chicago Theological Seminary, founding President of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Reverend Dr. Herman Haler, mentor, pastor, Associate Conference Minister of Michigan, distinguished alumni of Chicago Theological Seminary.
Reverend Dr. Henry Simmons, former Secretary for Ethnic and Minority Church Development. Dr. Charles E. Cobb Jr., former Executive Director of Commission for Racial Justice. Ms. Edith Guffey, Conference Minister, Kansas, Oklahoma, former Associate Conference Minister and UCC Chief Operating Officer and Administrator of the General Synod. Reverend Joseph H. Evans, UCC President. These are the ones on whose shoulders we stand in the spirit of our children.
From the distant land of Kenya, we find a tribe of warriors who have retained much of their cultural ancestry while also adapting to the changing world around them. The Maasai tribe has a greeting that many would find peculiar. When they encounter one another, they ask the sacred question, "And how are the children?" The Maasai have come to realize that their tribe is only as strong as the weakest and most vulnerable of society, and therefore they carefully care for the children of the village. It is proven that in order to grow into their most authentic selves, children must be protected, must be nurtured, must be loved and surrounded by their village. Here in the United States, if we were listening to the sound of the streets and the cries of our children, we would hear a collective wail because our young people are not okay. They are afraid and discouraged. They can't breathe, can't move, can't be heard over the sound of sirens, gunshots, and the stereotypes forced upon them as people of color. Our children come marching in the footsteps of our ancestors to demand a just world and the opportunity to grow into adulthood and be all that God has created them to be. Our ancestors have paved the way for this generation to emerge and continue the fight for equality, justice, and belonging as they proclaim Black Lives Matter. Miss Alexis Bond is one of our young people who comes with a bold message and faith. She is a 14-year-old high school sophomore who attends St. Albans Congregational Church in New York. Among all that Alexis is, she is a talented writer who has written an original acrostic poem to tell us what Juneteenth means to her and our children.
Juneteenth. J. Justice for all Black lives taken. U. United we stand to fight for equality. N. No Black man or woman deserves to die. E. Every Black life matters. T. The inequality and racism must stop now. E. Every Black person has had enough. E. Equality for all in George Floyd's honor. N. Never give up on what you believe in. T. Too long we've been fighting for our lives. And H. How can we say all lives matter when Black lives don't? This Juneteenth, let's celebrate the milestone of our culture, of the many achievements and accomplishments many African Americans have overcome but are yet still fighting for. In the spirit of our mothers.
Everyone keeps asking me how I am. And for the sake of trying to gather any form of coherent thoughts to be able to articulate those to you today has felt like an impossible task. I think in order to capture how I am, we have to begin with how I love. Over a decade ago, I fell in love with this beautiful and kind-hearted Nigerian Yoruba man. Yet that love was not realized or actualized until 4 years ago. Once our love was established in December of 2016, we sought to secure it with the church and the courts in July 2017. Olivia and Elias Bamboshe, my beautiful little girl and boy twins, were birthed out of the most intimate parts of sacred beings, out of love and desire and hope and every good and pleasing thing that I can fix my mind on. And they are descendants of a covenant with God that their parents made, and a contract that their parents made with the courts, that they are mine, to have and to hold through sickness and in health till death do us part. They are my rights and they are my inheritance. There is no conversation or discussion about to whom they belong, because they belong to me. They are mine to have and to hold forever and ever and ever. When George Floyd called for his mama, I couldn't breathe. And I still am trying to catch my breath. When I learned of Breonna Taylor's slaughtering, I have grown inconsolable. I have arrived here. As a mother, I believe our infrastructures may not be ours in terms of owning, but they become ours to leverage in this fight to protect Black life and lives. As a mother, I believe our people may not have the freedom of mind to live and to move and to take up their very being, but they must be adopted and be held by our most established until death do us part. As a mother, I believe we must protect what is ours by any means necessary. And we must believe that if God is for us, and I believe that God is, then there is nothing that can and should prevail for generations on end against us. As a mother, I believe once we begin to understand that God has always been on the side of the oppressed, we cease to be concerned about the institutions created to keep our children enslaved or in bondage. Ultimately, as a mother, I think and believe that this will be one of the greatest love stories ever told, because it's about a God and her people, and it's about the way in which Black women have held and will continue to hold our children and villages into freedom in the spirit of our village.
And why do elders and parents and children matter? My maternal grandmother gave birth on top of a kitchen table. No hospital would have her. Her baby received into the loving arms of a midwife and several brown-eyed aunties. She was born while the elder men sat by and held vigil at the door. Aging warriors committed to creating safe spaces for moms and babies. My grandmother gave birth to 6 children. And still a young mom, she lost her husband, who was run down by a white man on the side of the road as he changed a flat tire. My mom gave birth in a hospital, in a sterile, white hospital with no visitors allowed, no aunties, no rituals, just surrounded by white faces who meant well, perhaps. But right outside that delivery room, both of my grandmothers stood stoically watching and guarding. No evil spirit risked entry into their space. No evil power equal to their determination. I imagine my father also sat, fingers and wrists clenched, knowing that I would have greatness in me. As soon as the nurse came from the delivery room, me bundled in her arms, my grandmothers touched the soles of my feet and prayed. They prayed with deep voices and shrill chatter and spoke into the air, risking strange looks and dirty glances. Mom said they laid warm hands on the soles of my feet, caressed my brow, and they cried. And they thanked God and the ancestors for my safe return. Now pause, I said return. I was a newborn, but an old soul. I had returned to them and they had made a way for me. They stood vigil until I could become who the world needed me to become. My great-grandmother carried the water of this nation in her tears. My grandmother carried the weight of her generation on her back as she labored in low-wage jobs that assured her invisibility and her inhumanity. My mother carried the grit of this nation, navigating the ruthless taunts of white men, skipped over for promotion, all on a minimum salary that gave me a maximum living. I carry the clarity for this nation because I have witnessed the brutality of my people, and I know the plan you have for my son. But you should know that I gave birth to a Black man child. He was received by his grandmother and several brown-eyed aunties who prayed and shouted and held vigil with the ancestors daily. My mother carried him on her hip until he was too big to lift, giving me enough time to return to work early because my income supported many. She fought off the monsters under his bed so I could fight the monsters out here in these streets. He was steeped like brown sweetened tea through many generations and iterations. His eyes pierce lies. He is smart and kind and deeply connected to his spirits. His ancestors have told him what to do, and they are reborn again to stand vigil in this time. Because the flickers of lights that you see at the dawn of every new day are ancestors calling us to come near and prepare for battle. America, I have given birth, and he has returned to us to recover all that was lost and stolen. My friends, are you the reborn elders that will stand with him? In the spirit of the movement, he and we are called to action.
The current COVID-19 pandemic and the renewed uprising against racial violence and police brutality remind us in terribly painful and urgent ways that we live at the intersections of interlocking systems of oppression and injustice, and that requires an intersectional, multi-issue approach. This is something that the faith community, and particularly the UCC, is uniquely poised to do. Working at the intersections and centering the well-being of the most vulnerable goes to the heart of who we are as people of faith. The United Church of Christ is partnering with the Poor People's Campaign in tomorrow's mass digital mobilization, a national call for a moral revival, a call to address the policies and systems that are impacting our most vulnerable and marginalized brothers and sisters. There is a saying in the Poor People's Campaign, somebody's hurting my people, and it's gone on far too long. Someone is hurting my people, not somebody else's community, not somebody else's children, not somebody else's family. My people, my children, my family. This cry echoes in a powerful way the teachings of Jesus that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. The God of love is also the God of justice. Through faith-based action and advocacy, you can embody the history of resistance to racism and white supremacy in these days. Here are steps you can take right now to lift your justice voice, witness to the God of justice, and amplify the voices of our partners, especially those most directly impacted by unjust public policy. 1, join the Poor People's Campaign mass digital mobilization tomorrow on June 20th. 2, join the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign. Whatever the issue that you care most about, one of the most important ways to impact policy on those issues is by influencing the decision makers who will shape that policy. The United Church of Christ, Our Faith, Our Vote campaign equips UCC members and congregations with tools and resources for nonpartisan electoral engagement, voter registration, issue education, and voter mobilization and protection. 3, make sure you and your community are counted. Data collected from the census count impacts the way in which over $800 billion in federal spending is allocated for social services and essential infrastructure for communities all over the country. It takes less than 10 minutes to respond to the census, and that 10 minutes can impact 10 years of planning for community healthcare resources, public education, roads, public transportation, and emergency preparedness. You can respond to the census by phone, by mail, or online. And 4, join the United Church of Christ Justice and Peace Action Network. The November elections are not the finish line. They are the starting line. No matter the outcome of the elections, we must be positioned to create the political will to move decision makers through our justice advocacy. Network members receive weekly action alerts on a variety of issues, opportunities, and resources for public witness and advocacy organizing. Tools to engage in media advocacy, like letters to the editor and op-eds, which help to shift the public narrative. Engagement on all these fronts is part of the work of the Justice and Peace Action Network. Please join in action with us.
To the Christian Church. The Christian Church must respond to these new challenges and realities of racial injustice with a new approach and a new way forward. In order for us to be effective at the work of justice, we must make the commitment and begin the journey to become anti-racist. White supremacy and systemic racism are antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But more than just becoming anti-racist, we must adapt and better respond to the current realities, challenges, needs, and possibilities before us, and lead in new and bold ways. What we face as the Christian church is the very essence of who we are called to be. We must acknowledge that racism and white supremacy is a sin and start the journey to change the beliefs and attitudes that permeate our thinking and actions, to tear down biases, prejudice that leads to discrimination, profiling, and microaggressions, to tell the truth about race, racism, and white supremacy as social constructs, to heal people of African descent that have suffered for generations and still today, to transform all structures that perpetuate inequity, inequality, and deny justice. Our work must focus on maximizing the gifts within our local churches and equipping leaders with the capacity, skills, and tools to be effective leaders and advocates for justice. Trained in the art of community organizing and prophetic nonviolent direct action, we will be able to organize and build the power necessary to secure the change that we all desperately need and that the world hungers for. Here are some concrete action steps that we can begin to take now as the church. 1, make the commitment and start the journey to become anti-racist. We are called to be anti-racist as disciples and the Church of Jesus Christ. Becoming anti-racist is challenging. It requires the courage to begin and the determination to persevere. Being anti-racist must be central to our identity and our purpose as the church moving forward. 2, pledge to be a racial justice voter. In the Central Atlantic Conference of the United Church of Christ, as part of our Faith and Democracy 2020 campaign, we are calling on local churches, clergy, and justice leaders to be a racial justice voter. And we believe that as people of faith, our vote can serve as a powerful tool to rid our communities of systemic racism, injustice, hatred, and inequality. And we are calling on the United Church of Christ, the Christian church, to pledge to be a racial justice voter in this year's elections. 3, partner with a local or statewide chapter of Black Lives Matter or showing up for racial justice. We must do the work of ending systemic racism and white supremacy with organization with common goals and an agenda for collective power and action. These two organizations are at the forefront of addressing systemic racism. In addition to the Poor People's Campaign, we encourage you to reach out to a local or statewide chapter and build a relationship to do the work of racial justice in your community and your state. And finally, unite with UCC justice leaders, clergy, and local churches in your conference to build a powerful, faithful, and effective organizing network. This is our work in the Central Atlantic Conference. We can no longer do the work of justice in isolation without coordination, collaboration, and connection to the wider church, the ecumenical and interfaith community, and those in the secular community. Focused on being theologically and biblically grounded in justice, effectively trained, and an organized grassroots of leaders of clergy and local churches, we can make the whole of who we are greater than the sum of our parts. I hope you will join this United Church of Christ movement for racial justice.
In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, many around the world have lost not only their social support, but also their jobs, healthcare coverage, childcare, and even the sense of normalcy and stability. Scripture teaches in Jeremiah 29:11 that God's purpose for our lives is to give us a future and a hope. The United Church of Christ holds fast to this hope and new life by continuing to cast the vision for God's economy. God's economy does not exclude anyone from resources sufficient for well-being. This Juneteenth, we call upon people of faith to right the wrongs of racism and take moral action and reimagine our economy by creating opportunities that foster fair, equitable, and just economic development, economic empowerment, and wealth creation. As we focus this Juneteenth, we want to lift up the following areas for our economic stability and community reinvestment: to eliminate debt, to include but not be limited to medical and student loan and predatory lending practices and policies, to support and eliminate barriers for historically underutilized businesses and historically Black colleges and universities, and to close the racial wealth gap and educate and join the reparations movement. And you can be a part of this in the following ways. 1, call your US senators to push for the following additions to the HEROES Act that was already passed in the US House. Say this: we need to enact universal student loan debt cancellation. We also need to extend the Military Lending Act's 36% APR so that all new loans that are developed during this crisis are not predatory and high-cost loans. In your states, make sure there has been a suspension in fines and fees and the collection of criminal justice debt and enforcement, and push that it continues past the lifting of stay-at-home orders. And then advocate and give. In the midst of such a rise in medical debt, the United Church of Christ has committed to abolish $1.5 million in medical debt of essential workers who they themselves live at or below poverty level. This is part of our contribution or the continuation of the medical debt campaign nationally. And if you want to contribute, please donate to the United Church of Christ and designate it for the medical debt abolishment. Know that since the start of this crisis, business owners of color have been especially and unfairly hard hit. Active Black-owned businesses have declined by 41%. Business owners of color are less likely than white owners to have a relationship with a commercial lender. And businesses of color have historically lacked access to SBA or Small Business Administration loans and credit generally. So therefore, advocate federally. Advocate so that the payment protection process to be streamlined, for it does need to be streamlined, and that it will be an automatic forgiveness for loans under $100,000 for small businesses. Advocate locally. Make sure your city, municipality, and even your school system tracks the amount of money it spends in contracts with historically underutilized businesses and hold them accountable for increasing the percentage each year. Lift the stories and value added, the dividend, if you will, of historically Black colleges and universities. Know that HBCUs are economic mobility drivers, that they produce 42% of the country's Black engineers, 80% of its Black judges, and 40% of its African-American members of Congress. Yet, each year they only enroll about 228,000 students. Advocate and give to the UCC Endowed Justice Chair at Howard University. Advocate and continue to fight for the overhaul of student loans and student loan servicing. Therefore, we also need to focus on the racial wealth gap and know and recognize the racial wealth gap continues to increase. The median white family has 41 times more wealth than the median Black family, meaning that Black families have just over $3,500 in wealth while white families own $147,000. And despite how much we reform or legislate or even correct this current economic system, we will not bridge that divide that started when the first enslaved Africans came on these shores. Therefore, we ask that you join the United Church of Christ as we further prepare, study, and continue in our engagement in the movement for reparatory justice, reparations. Advocate and support HR 40 that is sponsored as the lead sponsor by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. A bill so that there will be a study and proposals given for reparations for African Americans. Advocate and support the work of the National African American Reparations Commission and even their event held this evening at 7 p.m. We offer this as our work together for our collective community as we truly do come to ensure that all individuals and families prosper. And as Jeremiah 29:11 states, have a future and a hope. Let's do it together.
In 1939, Billie Holiday recorded the song Strange Fruit, a song that described the common occurrence of lynching people of African American descent. At the turn of the century, lynching was the leading cause of preventable death for African Americans. An estimated 4,742 Blacks met their deaths at the hands of lynch mobs during the period 1882 to 1968. The assault on Black humanity has historic roots. Once people of African descent were brought to the New World, they suffered with little or no health care and were forced to live under unsanitary and cruel conditions that created the foundations for the poor health status and outcomes that continue today, known as the slave health deficit. The slave health deficit effects have persevered without significant challenge throughout U.S. history. Since 1980, Black health has deteriorated, and we now have the highest death rates in 13 of the 15 leading causes of death. And now we add COVID-19. It is no surprise that Black people are disproportionately adversely affected by this disease. Blacks comprise 13.4% of the US population and account for more than half of all COVID cases and almost 60% of the deaths. More than 20,000 African Americans have died from this disease. Today, we call upon local UCC churches and conferences to engage in the work of achieving health equity for all, to promote policies and programs that give people the opportunity to attain their full health potential by paying attention to the factors that affect and impact health, where people live, work, play, worship, and age. The newly formed UCC Racial and Ethnic Disparities RED Task Force calls you to action. Number one, pledge to act. Unite with UCC justice leaders, clergy, and local churches in your conference to eliminate racial and ethnic health disparities through education, dialogue, and action as adopted by the General Synod 27 resolution in 2009. Number two, prioritize public health and legislation to combat COVID-19. Urge members of Congress to prioritize public health infrastructure and paid sick leave and family medical leave in any future legislation to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Number three, say yes to dropping the case to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. Urge the President of the United States and members of the Supreme Court to keep the Affordable Care Act. Americans cannot afford to lose access to COVID-19 treatment, vaccines, and general health care. And finally, number four, Medicaid expansion. We ask that you urge your governors to expand Medicaid now if they have not already done so. Be the church and join the movement.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Many people are fighting to simply breathe. A livable wage to thrive in this world, a fair chance, the ability to gain equal pay. Well, I'm just trying to make it as a Black man in this country without being profiled, prejudged as a thug, a hoodlum, a menace to society before acting or opening up my mouth. My Black body matters. As a Black man living in America, I have to shield my body, my mind, my spirit from the hatred of others as a means for survival. My Black heritage has taught me how to cultivate self-love. Over time, I have learned that loving myself for exactly who I am in the face of those who wish me ill is one of the most radical political acts that I can do. The recent slayings of Black bodies have reaffirmed the reality that has haunted my soul ever since I gained consciousness of my body, that I'm not safe. The culture constantly whispers in my ear that my body does not matter in these United States. But those whispers are lies. They are wrong. My Black body does matter. The tragedies that have occurred these past months across the country also reemphasizes the importance of self-care. For me, self-care looks like weekly therapy sessions, which help me identify my truths, including meditation for my body, mind, and soul. Walking in the sunshine, take time spent with family and friends, looking at some Netflix and cooking and just breathing. Recently, the intentional practice of breathing has become easy to go to when all else fails. I can always return to my breath because my Black body does matter. I remain conscious of all of the death, destruction, and tragedy that so many often surround the bodies of my people, Black people. Despite my cultivation of resilience and methods of self-care, I have to force myself into consciousness, into the light. For me, it's far too easy to succumb to the darkness and to desire to live within the illusions that ignores promises. Remaining conscious is how I've learned to cultivate resilience and to generate the energy needed to push forward in social justice activism. I've learned to observe, but not be absorbed, because my Black body does matter. I will continue to fight every day and hope that these tragedies will become fewer and fewer. For now, I'm just happy to be alive. I am grateful that when tragedy strikes, I have the support of family and friends, a toolbox of self-care practices, and a resilient spirit that allows me to march onward. Despite what I see or what I hear, I know that my Black body too matters. And I hope that you recognize that yours do too, because all Black bodies matter. This was a piece adapted from Miss Candace Bond Thuralt, Esquire. Sacred, holy, and every present God, may we forever remember their names in the spirit of this movement.
Hear us clearly. We are fighting for our lives, for our freedom, for our future. We will no longer tolerate being lynched by anyone or any system. More importantly, we will eventually win this war of oppression against us. Ready or not, like it or not, here we stand.
On Monday, June 22nd, all those who registered and participated in today's webinar will receive updated information, links, and a thank you for being with us to celebrate, honor, and commemorate Juneteenth 2020. These are ways that you can join the movement by registering for the Sacred Conversations to End Racism Summer Institute, the Poor People's Campaign, which will be a virtual march tomorrow, Saturday, June 19th, 20th, and our Faith, Our Vote. And also check the links for the UN Decade for People of African Descent. We're grateful for your presence. We will close now with a sending prayer.
We thank all of those who have contributed to this moment. Thank all the panelists. Thank Reverend Dr. Velda Love for her leadership, and thank all of you for being present with us. Ascending blessing. We follow the light as we journey into the night, guided by the Great Spirit. We follow the light of the ancestors, the light of those who have gone before. We follow the light, knowing that we will not rest until freedom is lived by all. We follow the light, knowing that we do not travel alone, because we are light bearers, carrying the light of those who have gone before. Go in the light, be the light that you have called to be. Ashe, ashe, ashe. Go in peace.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, and a long way from home. I'm gonna sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes when the spirit says to march around. Sometimes when the spirit says motherless child, and watch the walls come tumbling down. I'm gonna sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes when the spirit says to march around. Sometimes when the spirit says motherless child, and watch the walls come tumbling